The street where Jamie lived was quiet. A narrow lane lined with modest houses whose walls bore the weathering of time. At the very end of the road stood an old, creaky house with peeling paint and windows that always seemed to be half closed. That house belonged to Mrs. Alma, the elderly widow whom most people in the neighborhood referred to as the grumpy old lady. Jamie had heard all the rumors, how she disliked children, how she refused to lend her tools to neighbors, and how she had turned her front yard into an untamed jungle. But to Jamie, none of it mattered. It was a cold November evening when Jamie first noticed something unusual. As he walked home from school, he glanced toward Mrs. Alma's house. Usually there would be a dim light in the window, but tonight the house was shrouded in complete darkness. The air seemed heavier, almost ominous, and the brittle leaves under his sneakers crackled like breaking glass. Something wasn't right. "Mrs. Alma?" Jamie called, standing at the gate of her yard. No response. For a moment Jamie considered walking away. After all, it wasn't his business. But then he remembered what his mother always said. Kindness doesn't need an invitation. It just needs a chance. He pushed open the rusty gate, which groaned in protest, and stepped into the yard. The path to the front door was overgrown with weeds and scattered with broken branches. Reaching the porch, Jamie knocked firmly. "Mrs. Alma, are you okay?" Still nothing. Hesitantly, he tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. The door creaked open to reveal a dim interior that smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The silence inside was deafening. "Hello?" Jamie's voice echoed. Then he heard it, a faint groan coming from the living room. Heart pounding, Jamie followed the sound and found Mrs. Alma slumped in an old armchair, her face pale and her breath shallow. A small table nearby was cluttered with crumpled tissues and an empty glass of water. She was clearly unwell. "Mrs. Alma!" Jamie rushed to her side. "Are you hurt? Should I call someone?" Her eyelids fluttered open, and she squinted at him. "Jamie? What are you doing here?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "You weren't answering, and your house was dark. Are you okay?" She gave a weak shake of her head. I don't feel well. Couldn't get out of bed all day. Tried to, but..." Her voice trailed off. Jamie looked around, noticing how unkempt the house was. Dishes piled high in the sink, unopened letters on the table, and a clock that had stopped ticking. Clearly Mrs. Alma had been struggling for a while. "Wait here. I'm going to get help," Jamie said. "No," she rasped, gripping his arm weakly. Don't call anyone. Just some water, please." Jamie hesitated but nodded. He hurried to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and brought it back to her. Mrs. Alma sipped it slowly, her hand trembling. "Thank you," she murmured, leaning back into the chair. Jamie stood there, unsure of what to do next. Finally he said, "I'll be back tomorrow to check on you. You need someone to help, and I can do it." Mrs. Alma looked at him, her gray eyes softening for the first time. "You're a strange boy, Jamie," she said weakly, "but thank you." As Jamie walked home that evening, he felt a strange mix of emotions, worry, determination, and an inexplicable warmth. He didn't know what the coming days would bring, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let Mrs. Alma face this alone. To be continued in Chapter 2. Ban Noi. Chapter 2. ChatGPT Noi. Chapter 2. A Commitment. Made the following morning, Jamie woke early, his mind replaying the events of the previous evening. He felt a quiet resolve stirring in his chest. Mrs. Alma needed help, and he was going to provide it. After finishing his breakfast, a hurried piece of toast, he grabbed his coat and a backpack filled with essentials he thought Mrs. Alma might need. Some bread, a bottle of water, a few cans of soup, and a flashlight. Jamie didn't tell his mother much, only mentioning he was checking on a neighbor. When he arrived at Mrs. Alma's house, the scene looked the same as the night before. Dark windows and a silence that seemed heavier in the light of day. He knocked twice before opening the door and stepping inside. "Mrs. Alma," he called, setting his bag down near the entrance. "In here," came her faint voice from the living room. Jamie entered to find her still in the armchair, bundled in a faded quilt. She looked slightly better, though still pale, and her hands shook as she adjusted the blanket. "You came back," she said softly, her tone tinged with surprise. "Of course," Jamie replied, unpacking the supplies he brought. "I brought you some food and water. Have you eaten anything?" Mrs. Alma shook her head. "Not much appetite lately." Jamie handed her a slice of bread, urging her to take a bite. She hesitated but eventually nibbled at it, the effort seeming monumental. As she ate, Jamie glanced around the room. It was cluttered with newspapers, empty teacups, and trinkets that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. A thin layer of dust coated everything. "How long have you been like this?" Jamie asked gently. Mrs. Alma sighed. "A few days, maybe a week. I've been feeling weak. Thought it'd pass, but it didn't." "Why didn't you call someone? A friend? Family?" She looked away, her voice barely audible. "Don't have anyone to call." Jamie felt a pang of sadness. He hadn't known much about Mrs. Alma before this, but her words hinted at a loneliness he couldn't ignore. "Well, you have me now," he said firmly. "I can come every day after school. Help clean up, cook something if you need it." Mrs. Alma blinked at him, her expression unreadable. "Why would you do that, Jamie? People they don't just help for no reason." Jamie shrugged, uncomfortable with the question. "I don't know. It just feels like the right thing to do." For a moment, Mrs. Alma said nothing. Then she gave a small, tired smile. "You're a strange boy," she repeated, but there was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. Over the next hour, Jamie busied himself tidying up the living room. He gathered the empty cups and took them to the kitchen, scrubbed the grime off the counters, and even opened a few windows to let in fresh air. The house felt less oppressive already. "Do you have a doctor you usually see?" Jamie asked as he worked. "There's a clinic nearby," Mrs. Alma said, "but I haven't gone in years. Too much trouble." "I think you should go," Jamie said firmly. "If you're this sick, you need to see someone." Mrs. Alma sighed but didn't argue. "Maybe. Soon," she murmured. By the time Jamie left that afternoon, Mrs. Alma's house looked a little brighter, and she seemed a little stronger. As he walked home, Jamie felt a small spark of pride. It wasn't much, but he was making a difference. What he didn't realize was that his visits were just the beginning. Mrs. Alma's illness was more serious than either of them could have guessed, and the days ahead would test Jamie's resolve in ways he never imagined. To be continued in Chapter 3, Ban John Noi. Chapter 3, ChatGPT John Noi. Chapter 3, The Weight of a Promise. The following days blurred into a routine. Jamie would rush home after school, scarf down a quick snack, and head straight to Mrs. Alma's house. Each day brought small improvements: a cleaner living room, fresher air, and a neighbor who seemed slightly more at ease. But it wasn't enough. By the end of the week, Mrs. Alma's condition worsened. Her voice grew weaker, her skin turned an alarming shade of gray, and she coughed with a force that rattled her frail frame. Jamie knew he was out of his depth. On Friday afternoon, he decided to confront her. "You need to see a doctor," Jamie said, standing by her armchair with his arms crossed. "This isn't getting better." Mrs. Alma sighed, sinking deeper into the worn cushions. "Doctors cost money, Jamie, and I'm too tired to go." Jamie clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. "But you can't just stay like this. What if it gets worse? What if—" He stopped, the thought too terrible to finish. Mrs. Alma's eyes softened. "You're a good boy, Jamie, but I've lived a long life. If this is my time, then—" "It's not your time," Jamie snapped, louder than he intended. The sound echoed in the quiet house. "You can't just give up." The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of an old clock. Mrs. Alma looked at him, startled by his outburst. For a moment, Jamie thought she might argue, but instead, she sighed deeply. "All right," she said finally. "If it means that much to you, I'll go. But only if you help me get there." Relief flooded Jamie's chest. "I will. I promise." The journey to the clinic. The next morning, Jamie woke early, nervous energy coursing through him. He had spent the evening convincing his mother to help. Though skeptical at first, she eventually agreed to drive them to the clinic. When Jamie arrived at Mrs. Alma's house, she was already dressed in a threadbare coat and scarf, sitting stiffly by the door. She looked smaller than ever, her frame swallowed by the oversized coat. "I feel silly," she muttered, as Jamie helped her to her feet. "You look great," he said with a grin, though he could see the effort it took her to stand. The drive to the clinic was quiet. Mrs. Alma stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Jamie sat beside her in the back seat, stealing glances at her now and then. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded but didn't say anything. At the clinic, a nurse greeted them with a warm smile and led them to an examination room. Jamie waited anxiously in the corner as the doctor checked Mrs. Alma's vitals. "Severe respiratory infection," the doctor said after a thorough examination. "It's a good thing you came in when you did. A few more days without treatment, and it could have been critical." The words sent a chill down Jamie's spine. He glanced at Mrs. Alma, who looked equally shaken. "We'll start you on antibiotics right away," the doctor continued, "and you'll need plenty of rest and fluids. Do you have someone to help take care of you at home?" Mrs. Alma hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Jamie stepped forward before she could speak. "I'll help," he said firmly. The doctor looked surprised, but nodded. "That's good to hear. She'll need it." A new routine. Over the next week, Jamie's responsibilities grew. He helped Mrs. Alma take her medication on time, made sure she ate nutritious meals, and spent hours keeping her company. Slowly but surely, her strength began to return. But it wasn't just her body that healed. Mrs. Alma, who had always been reserved and distant, began to open up. One evening, as they sat in the now tidy living room, she spoke softly. "You remind me of someone," she said, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. "Who?" Jamie asked, curious. "My grandson," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He was about your age when when he passed." Jamie's heart ached at her words. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Alma." She shook her head. "It was a long time ago, but watching you, helping me the way you do, it feels like he's here again, just for a little while." Jamie didn't know what to say. Instead, he reached out and placed his hand gently over hers. "You're not alone, Mrs. Alma," he said softly. "Not anymore." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and gave him a small, fragile smile. To be continued in Chapter 4. Ban Jan Noi. Chapter 4. ChatGPT Jan Noi. Chapter 4. A Light in the Storm. The first snow of winter fell softly one evening, blanketing the quiet street in a hushed stillness. Jamie had just finished shoveling Mrs. Alma's driveway, the cold biting at his fingers through his gloves. Inside, the warmth of the house welcomed him as he shook off the snow and hung his coat by the door. Mrs. Alma sat by the window, her favorite armchair now surrounded by neat stacks of books and small pots of herbs Jamie had helped her grow. She was knitting a scarf, her hands steadier than they had been weeks ago. "Still at it?" Jamie teased as he walked in, his cheeks pink from the cold. "I promised you a scarf, didn't I?" she replied with a wry smile. "Just don't expect it to be fashionable." Jamie chuckled and plopped onto the couch. It had become their nightly ritual, Jamie sharing stories about school while Mrs. Alma shared snippets of her life, each conversation weaving them closer together. But that night, The peace was interrupted by a knock at the door. Jamie glanced at Mrs. Alma, who looked equally puzzled. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. "No," she said, setting down her knitting. Jamie walked to the door and opened it cautiously. Standing on the porch was a man in his 40s, his face gaunt and his clothes worn. He held a small, battered suitcase in one hand. "Can I help you?" Jamie asked, unsure of what to make of the stranger. "I'm looking for Alma Connors," the man said, his voice hoarse. Jamie hesitated, glancing back toward the living room. "Who are you?" "I'm her son," the man replied. A long-awaited reunion. Jamie stood frozen for a moment, the words sinking in. He hadn't known Mrs. Alma had a son. She'd never mentioned him. "Wait here," Jamie said, stepping back inside. He found Mrs. Alma still in her chair, her knitting forgotten as she stared at the door with wide eyes. "Who is it, Jamie?" she asked, her voice trembling. It's your son," Jamie said softly. Her breath caught, and for a moment she looked as though she might faint. Then, slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, gripping the armrest for support. "Let him in," she whispered. Jamie opened the door, and the man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Mrs. Alma. His expression softened, a mix of guilt and relief washing over his features. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "Matthew," Mrs. Alma replied, her voice barely audible. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Jamie watched as Mrs. Alma took a hesitant step forward, her frail frame seeming smaller than ever. "You came back," she said, her voice trembling. "I should have come sooner," Matthew said, setting down his suitcase. I'm sorry, Mom. For everything." Tears welled in Mrs. Alma's eyes as she reached out, and Matthew stepped forward to embrace her. For a long moment, they stood there, holding each other, the years of distance and pain melting away in the warmth of their hug. Jamie, feeling like an intruder, quietly slipped into the kitchen to give them privacy. An unwelcome storm. Later that evening, after Matthew had settled in, Jamie joined them at the table. Mrs. Alma had prepared tea, her hands steady as she poured the steaming liquid into 3 mismatched cups. Matthew explained his absence, his words hesitant and laced with regret. He had left town years ago after a falling out with his father, and though he had planned to return, life had pulled him in different directions. "I thought about calling," he admitted, staring into his tea. "But I was afraid you wouldn't want to hear from me." Mrs. Alma reached across the table and placed a hand over his. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Jamie watched the exchange, his heart swelling with warmth. He had spent weeks worrying about Mrs. Alma's loneliness, and now it seemed as though a missing piece of her life had returned. But as the night wore on, Jamie couldn't shake a nagging feeling. There was something guarded about Matthew's demeanor, a shadow that lingered behind his eyes. A desperate plea. 2 days later, the storm arrived. Not snow, but the storm Jamie had feared. Jamie arrived at Mrs. Alma's house after school to find her sitting alone in the living room, her expression troubled. The scarf she'd been knitting lay forgotten on the floor. "What's wrong?" Jamie asked, setting his backpack down. "It's Matthew," she said quietly. He asked me for money." Jamie's stomach sank. "Money? For what?" "He didn't say," she replied, her voice tinged with worry. "Just that he's in trouble. Something about debts." Jamie sat down across from her, his mind racing. He wanted to believe Matthew's intentions were pure, but the sudden request felt off. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Mrs. Alma sighed. "I don't know. He's my son, Jamie. I can't just turn him away. But I also can't afford to give him much." Jamie nodded slowly, his heart heavy. He didn't want to distrust Matthew, but he couldn't ignore the unease creeping into his chest. Maybe Maybe we can talk to him together, Jamie suggested. Mrs. Alma looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Jamie. I don't know what I'd do without you. As the sun set that evening, Jamie resolved to stand by Mrs. Alma's side, no matter what lay ahead. The bond they had forged over the past weeks was stronger than ever, and Jamie wasn't about to let anything or anyone jeopardize her happiness. But deep down, he knew the storm was far from over. To be continued in Chapter 5. Ban Ja Noi, Chapter 5. Viet Lien Mak. Ke Chia No Trong, Chapter ChatGPT John Noi. Chapter 5. Beneath the Surface. The next morning, Jamie arrived at Mrs. Alma's house earlier than usual, determined to find clarity about Matthew's intentions. He knocked on the door, but instead of Mrs. Alma's soft, "Come in," it was Matthew who opened it. "Jamie," Matthew said, his voice carrying a mix of politeness and weariness. "Mom's resting. What do you need?" Jamie hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I just came to check on her. Can I see her?" Matthew's jaw tightened for a brief moment before he stepped aside. "She's in the living room." Jamie walked in, his gaze flicking over the house. It felt different, tenser, like the air was heavier. Mrs. Alma was sitting in her armchair, staring out the window with a distant expression. She turned when she heard Jamie's footsteps, her face lighting up slightly. "Jamie," she said, her voice as warm as always. "It's good to see you." "Are you okay?" Jamie asked, kneeling beside her chair. "I'm fine," she replied, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a little tired." Matthew hovered in the doorway, watching the two of them with a guarded expression. Jamie glanced at him, then back at Mrs. Alma. "Can we talk?" Jamie asked softly. Mrs. Alma nodded, and Jamie turned to Matthew. "Do you mind giving us a minute?" Matthew hesitated, his eyes flicking between them. "Sure," he said finally, his tone neutral. He left the room, but Jamie noticed he didn't go far. Once they were alone, Jamie leaned in closer. "Mrs. Alma, are you sure about helping him?" She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know, Jamie. He's my son. He's family. But I can tell he's not telling me everything." Jamie frowned. If he's in trouble, giving him money might not fix it. It could just make things worse. Mrs. Alma nodded slowly, her eyes filled with worry. "But if I don't help him, what kind of mother would I be?" Jamie wanted to argue, but the pain in her voice stopped him. He understood her struggle. She had spent so many years alone, and now that Matthew was back, she was clinging to the hope that this could be her chance to rebuild their bond. Before Jamie could respond, Matthew re-entered the room, carrying a cup of tea for his mother. He set it down on the small table beside her and glanced at Jamie. "You're worried about me, aren't you?" Matthew said bluntly, his tone catching Jamie off guard. Jamie straightened, meeting his gaze. "I just want to make sure Mrs. Alma is okay." Matthew chuckled humorlessly. "I get it. You've been looking out for her, and you've done a great job. But you don't need to worry. I'm not here to hurt her." "Then why not tell her everything?" Jamie shot back, his voice firm. "If you need help, why not explain why?" Matthew's eyes darkened. "It's complicated." Jamie didn't back down. "Complicated doesn't mean you can keep her in the dark." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick between them. Then Mrs. Alma spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Matthew," she said, looking up at her son, "I want to help you, but I need to know the truth. Please." Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked away, his expression torn. Finally he spoke. "I owe money," he admitted. "A lot of money. To people who don't take no for an answer." Jamie's stomach sank. He had feared it was something like this. "How much?" Mrs. Alma asked, her voice trembling. Matthew hesitated. 10,000. The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Jamie's mind raced. $10,000? That was more money than he could even comprehend. He looked at Mrs. Alma, whose face had gone pale. I don't have that kind of money, she said softly. I know, Matthew replied, his voice cracking. I wasn't going to ask you for all of it. Just whatever you can spare. Enough to keep them off my back for a little while. Jamie clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. And then what? What happens after that? Do you think they'll just go away? Matthew shot him a sharp look. You don't understand, kid. These people… I understand that dragging Mrs. Alma into this isn't fair, Jamie interrupted. Enough, Mrs. Alma said, her voice firm despite her frailty. Both Jamie and Matthew fell silent, turning to her. I need time to think, she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Matthew, you're my son, and I love you. But this is too much to decide right now. Matthew looked like he wanted to argue, but he held his tongue. He nodded stiffly and left the room, his footsteps heavy as he climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom. Jamie stayed with Mrs. Alma a little longer, sitting quietly by her side. Finally, she reached out and took his hand. Thank you, she said softly, for standing by me. Jamie squeezed her hand, his heart aching for her. You don't have to do this alone, Mrs. Alma. We'll figure it out together. As he walked home that evening, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even more complicated. The storm wasn't just brewing anymore. It was here, to be continued in Chapter 6. Ben Janoi. Chapter 6. ChatGPT Janoi. Chapter 6. The depth of sacrifice. The tension in Mrs. Alma's house hung heavy, like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Jamie returned the next day, his heart weighed down with worry. Matthew's presence had altered the fragile peace they'd built, and Jamie couldn't ignore the unease that came with every glance Matthew cast his mother's way. When Jamie arrived, Mrs. Alma was in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she stirred a pot of soup. The clinking of the spoon against the pot echoed in the otherwise silent house. Mrs. Alma, Jamie said softly, startling her. Oh, Jamie, she said, turning to face him. She looked older than ever, the lines on her face deepened by the weight of her thoughts. I didn't hear you come in. Jamie stepped closer, taking the spoon from her shaking hands. You should sit down. I'll take care of this. She hesitated, but eventually sank into a chair at the small kitchen table. Jamie worked in silence for a moment, his back to her, before he finally spoke. Have you decided what to do? Mrs. Alma didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. I want to help him, Jamie. He's my son. But I'm scared. Jamie turned, his heart aching at the sight of her tear-filled eyes. It's not your responsibility to fix his mistakes, he said gently. You've already done so much for him just by letting him come back. I know, she said, her voice breaking. But what kind of mother turns her back on her child when he's in trouble? Before Jamie could respond, Matthew entered the kitchen, his expression guarded. He looked between them, sensing the weight of their conversation. Am I interrupting something? He asked. No, Mrs. Alma said quickly, wiping at her eyes. Jamie's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. He finished stirring the soup, ladled it into bowls, and set them on the table. They ate in silence, the tension thick. Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that Matthew was watching Mrs. Alma closely, his gaze calculating. After dinner, Matthew cleared his throat. Mom, can we talk for a minute? Alone. Mrs. Alma hesitated, glancing at Jamie. He nodded, though his stomach churned with unease. I'll be in the living room, Jamie said, stepping away. From the couch, Jamie strained to hear their conversation, but their voices were too muffled to make out clearly. He could only pick up fragments. Matthew's voice rising in desperation, Mrs. Alma's quieter responses. After nearly half an hour, the door to the kitchen creaked open, and Matthew walked out. He didn't look at Jamie as he passed, heading upstairs without a word. Jamie stood and walked into the kitchen, finding Mrs. Alma sitting at the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "What happened?" Jamie asked. She looked up at him, her eyes red and tired. "I told him I'd help," she said quietly. Jamie's heart sank. "Mrs. Alma, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted. "And you're right. He should fix this himself. But Jamie, he's my son. If I don't help him, who will?" Jamie didn't know what to say. He wanted to argue, to tell her this wasn't her burden to bear, but he could see the resolve in her eyes. "How much are you giving him?" Jamie asked finally. 5,000, she said, her voice barely audible. "It's nearly everything I have saved." Jamie's chest tightened. "You're risking everything, Mrs. Alma. What if this doesn't solve his problem? What if it just makes things worse?" "I don't know," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But I have to try." The next morning, Jamie arrived earlier than usual, determined to keep an eye on Matthew. He found him in the living room, pacing nervously with his phone pressed to his ear. "Yeah, I've got the money," Matthew was saying. $5,000. It'll buy me some time." Jamie's fists clenched at the words. Matthew wasn't using the money to solve his problem. He was stalling. As Matthew hung up, he turned and saw Jamie standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Matthew crossed his arms, his expression defensive. "What do you want?" he snapped. "I want to know what you're really doing with that money," Jamie said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Matthew scoffed. "It's none of your business, kid." "It is my business if you're taking advantage of Mrs. Alma," Jamie shot back. "She's giving you everything she has, and you're just stalling." "Buying time for what?" Matthew's jaw tightened. "You don't understand how this works. These people don't just go away because you ask nicely. I need to pay them off so they don't hurt me." "Or so they don't hurt you yet," Jamie countered. "You're not fixing anything. You're just making things worse." Matthew took a step closer, his expression darkening. "Watch it, kid. You don't know me." "No," Jamie said, holding his ground. "But I know Mrs. Alma, and she doesn't deserve this." Before Matthew could respond, Mrs. Alma appeared in the hallway, her face pale. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jamie hesitated, unsure how much to say. But before he could speak, Matthew turned to her. "Don't listen to him, Mom," Matthew said quickly. "He's just a kid. He doesn't understand." Mrs. Alma looked between them, her eyes filling with doubt. "Jamie?" Jamie took a deep breath. "Mrs. Alma, he's not using the money to solve his problem. He's just buying time." Mrs. Alma's face fell, and she turned to Matthew. "Is that true?" Matthew hesitated, then sighed. "I just need time, Mom. That's all. I'll figure it out." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Alma's shoulders slumped, and she looked at Matthew with a mix of sorrow and disappointment. "I can't do this," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I can't keep giving and giving, only for you to throw it away. I've spent my whole life trying to protect you, but I can't protect you from yourself." Matthew opened his mouth to argue, but Mrs. Alma held up a hand. "Enough! You need to leave, Matthew. I can't help you anymore." Jamie watched as Matthew's face hardened, the vulnerability replaced by anger. Without another word, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Mrs. Alma sank into a chair, her body trembling with silent sobs. Jamie rushed to her side, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said softly. She shook her head. "Don't be. You were right, Jamie. I didn't want to see it." As Jamie sat beside her, the storm outside raged on, but inside, a quiet strength began to take root. Mrs. Alma had made a difficult choice, one that would leave scars, but also one that would give her a chance to heal. And Jamie vowed to be there, every step of the way, to be continued in Chapter 7. Bon Janoi, Chapter 7. ChatGPT Janoi, Chapter 7, The Aftermath. The next morning, the house felt eerily quiet. For weeks, the small space had been filled with the sounds of tension. Matthew pacing, raised voices, the weight of unspoken worries hanging in the air. But now, without him, the silence seemed heavier. Jamie arrived to find Mrs. Alma in her usual armchair by the window, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. She stared outside, her gaze distant as if searching for answers among the falling snow. "Good morning," Jamie said softly, pulling off his coat and hanging it by the door. Mrs. Alma turned to him, her expression tired but calm. "Good morning, Jamie." Jamie sat on the couch, unsure of what to say. After the confrontation with Matthew, he had worried about her, worried she might regret her decision, or worse, collapse under the weight of it. But while she looked weary, there was a certain resolve in her demeanor, like a tree that had weathered a storm and remained standing. "Did you sleep?" Jamie asked. "Not much," she admitted, her voice steady but low. "It's strange, you know. Even after everything, I thought I'd feel relief. But all I feel is emptiness." Jamie nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Alma. You gave him a chance to change, and it's up to him now. You can't carry his choices forever." She looked at him, her gray eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "You're wise beyond your years, Jamie. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have figured it out," Jamie replied with a small smile. "You're stronger than you think," she chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Stronger, maybe. But I'm also tired, Jamie. I'm tired of always being the one to pick up the pieces." Over the next few days, Jamie stayed close, helping her adjust to the absence of Matthew. They worked together to restore a sense of normalcy to the house, tidying up the mess left behind. It was during one of these afternoons, as Jamie was dusting the bookshelves, that he stumbled across a photo tucked between two old novels. It was a picture of Mrs. Alma, much younger, standing beside a boy who looked to be about Jamie's age. The boy was grinning ear to ear, his arms slung around her shoulders. "Is this Matthew?" Jamie asked, holding up the photo. Mrs. Alma glanced at it and smiled wistfully. "Yes, that was taken on his 12th birthday. We went to the park that day, just the two of us. He wanted to ride the carousel over and over until he couldn't stand straight." Jamie sat beside her, studying the photo. "You look so happy." "We were," she said softly. "Back then, it felt like we had the whole world ahead of us. I never imagined it would turn out like this." Jamie hesitated, then asked, "Do you think he'll come back?" Mrs. Alma was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. I hope he does. But only if he's ready to make things right." Jamie nodded, sensing the weight of her words. He didn't press further, knowing she needed time to process everything. A week passed, then two. The days grew colder, the snow piling high outside. Jamie continued his visits, helping Mrs. Alma with errands and chores, keeping her company through the long winter evenings. Slowly, she began to regain her strength, not just physically, but emotionally. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mrs. Alma spoke up unexpectedly. "Jamie, I've been thinking about what you said, about how I've done enough." Jamie looked at her, curious. "What about it?" "You were right," she said firmly. "I've spent so much of my life trying to fix other people's problems, especially Matthew's. But it's time I started taking care of myself." Jamie smiled. "That's good, Mrs. Alma. You deserve it." She nodded, a hint of determination in her eyes. "I've decided to use what's left of my savings to fix up the house. It's been falling apart for years, and I've always put it off, thinking the money could go to something more important. But this house, it's my home. It deserves some love, too." "That's a great idea," Jamie said, "and if you need help, I'm here." "I know you are," she said, reaching over to pat his hand. "And for that, I'll always be grateful." One night, as Jamie was leaving, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the yard. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized Matthew, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his head bowed against the cold. "What are you doing here?" Jamie asked, his voice low but firm. Matthew looked up, his expression conflicted. I just wanted to check on her. Is she okay?" "She's doing better," Jamie said bluntly. "Better without the stress you brought." Matthew flinched but nodded. "I deserve that." He hesitated, then added, "Look, I know I screwed up. I've been trying to figure things out. I don't know how to fix everything." Jamie crossed his arms. "You start by being honest, with yourself and with her. She deserves that much." Matthew's shoulders sagged. "You're right. I just don't know if she'll even want to see me." Jamie stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "She's your mom. She'll always want to see you, but it's up to you to make it worth her while." Matthew nodded slowly. "Thanks, kid." "Don't thank me," Jamie said. "Thank her, and mean it." As Jamie walked away, he glanced back once to see Matthew still standing there, staring up at the house. Whether he would knock on the door or walk away, Jamie didn't know, but in that moment he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, Matthew could find his way back. To be continued in Chapter 8. Banjanoi. Chapter 8. ChatGPT, Janoi. Chapter 8. The Light Returns. A soft knock at the door echoed through Mrs. Alma's house the next evening, interrupting the quiet hum of the television. Jamie, sitting on the couch with a plate of cookies in hand, looked toward Mrs. Alma, whose knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "Were you expecting someone?" Jamie asked. She shook her head, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "No." Jamie stood, setting the plate aside, and walked to the door. He opened it cautiously, and there, standing on the porch, was Matthew. His coat was dusted with snow, and his face was a mixture of apprehension and hope. "Hey, kid," Matthew said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jamie didn't reply right away. He stepped aside, gesturing for Matthew to come in. Matthew hesitated, then nodded and entered, the warmth of the house immediately flushing his cold cheeks. In the living room, Mrs. Alma had risen from her chair, her hands clutching the back of it for support. Her eyes widened when she saw her son, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Hi, Mom," Matthew said finally, his voice breaking. "Matthew," she whispered, her tone a mix of relief and caution. "You came back." Matthew nodded, his gaze falling to the floor. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me after everything." Mrs. Alma's lips quivered, but she steadied herself. "You're my son. Of course I want to see you. But—" She hesitated, her voice growing firmer. "If you've come to ask for more, I can't do it. I've given all I can." Matthew shook his head quickly. "No, Mom. That's not why I'm here. I swear." He looked up, his eyes glistening with tears. "I'm here because I need to apologize. For everything. For the money, for the lies, for letting you down. I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice hung in the air, and Jamie watched as Mrs. Alma's rigid posture softened. She stepped closer, her hands trembling, and reached out to touch Matthew's arm. "I've waited a long time to hear that," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But Matthew, being sorry isn't enough. You need to show me you mean it." "I know," Matthew said, his voice filled with determination. "I've started looking for work. I'm staying at a shelter right now, and they've got programs to help me get back on my feet. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying, that I'm done running." Jamie felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time, Matthew's words didn't feel like empty promises. Mrs. Alma pulled her son into a hug, her frail arms wrapping tightly around him. "That's all I ever wanted," she whispered. The next few weeks brought a cautious hope back into Mrs. Alma's life. Matthew began visiting regularly, each time bringing small updates about his progress. a new job at a warehouse, plans to rent a small apartment, and even a repayment plan for the money he owed her. Jamie stayed by Mrs. Alma's side, helping her navigate this new chapter. He watched as the lines of worry on her face softened, replaced by a quiet joy that had been missing for so long. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Mrs. Alma turned to Jamie with a warm smile. "You know, none of this would have happened without you," she said. Jamie blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "If you hadn't been here," she continued, "I don't think I would have had the strength to face any of this. You reminded me that it's okay to let go, to set boundaries, and to still hold on to hope." Jamie felt his cheeks flush. "I just wanted to help." "And you did," she said firmly, "more than you'll ever know." On a snowy afternoon just before Christmas, Matthew arrived with a surprise. He walked into the living room carrying a box of ornaments and a small, scraggly Christmas tree. "I thought we could decorate it together," he said, setting the box down. Mrs. Alma chuckled, her eyes sparkling. "It's been years since I had a tree." "Well, it's time to change that," Matthew replied. Jamie joined them as they carefully unwrapped the ornaments and hung them on the branches. The tree was crooked, and some of the ornaments were chipped, but it was perfect. As they worked, Mrs. Alma hummed softly, a tune Jamie didn't recognize, but that filled the room with warmth. When they were finished, they stood back to admire their handiwork. "It's beautiful," Mrs. Alma said, her voice thick with emotion. Matthew nodded, his arm draped around her shoulders. "It's a start." Jamie watched them, his heart full. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but in that moment, the house felt whole again. As the lights on the tree twinkled softly, Jamie realized that this wasn't just a story about helping someone in need. It was a story about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. And for Mrs. Alma, it was the beginning of a brighter, more hopeful chapter in her life.